What's up guys, welcome back to the channel. So best tier list for Diablo 4 after the most recent update that we got over here, which is on June 27th. This is the mega patch that came out. So a lot of people want to know what's the best character to play right now. And it really does also come down to a lot of factors. We're talking about, are you willing to gear this character with the best in slot with everything? Because certain characters, they get way better with time. Certain characters, like for example, the Rogue, you literally just need the twisting blades aspect and you're going to be zooming through content. So it really depends on how much time you're willing to put in a character, because most players that will play this game, just as a heads up, will never reach level 100. They will never do the Uber Lilith. That's just, you know, the reality of this game, because it takes so dang long to hit higher levels in the game. Even with the most recent buff, this does definitely help out. But I just gotta go ahead and start off with the video mentioning certain things in terms of a tier list. It's kind of hard just to say this is the best character, because there are a lot of other characters that can move a lot faster, therefore actually getting even faster clears, even though their DPS numerically hitting for 1,000,000 damage does not matter at a certain point when you're unable to actually clear the content, because the game gets quite hard in terms of like monsters damage just gets insane when you're doing some of these sigils for the Nightmare Dungeon. So starting right off, I'm going to go ahead and use this metric at the start, because a lot of people just want to know, well, what character does the most damage? Well, the thing is that Uber Lilith is probably the best numerical stat in terms of like a DPS dummy, right? There's nothing in town that we can just hit to see what's the highest DPS. So starting right off, I'm not going to count any glitches or any things where like, people are hitting for 100 million damage. A lot of these things have been nerfed and they're not supposed to actually exist in the game, so I will not be counting that. So I'm just going to use the Uber Lilith kind of as a guideline here, at least for mentioning what's the highest DPS, because I always get asked, well, what class does the most damage? It depends on one, your build, and on top of that, it also depends on like realistic DPS versus true DPS are two different things that you can actually try to shoot for, because getting the highest number, well, the Necromancer can get hit for millions of damage, which is fantastic. So I'm going to use this kind of as a reference in terms of how fast people are killing the Uber Lilith. This is the hardest thing in the game. So there is a 90-second kill with a Necromancer. I'll link these down below. I'm not going to play out the full video because that's kind of pointless, because people want to just know what's the highest amount of damage that you can output, and this is kind of our metric right now. So in terms of Lilith, it was like 90 seconds over here by Rob. We also have a Rogue that did it in 2 minutes, so that's relatively close as well. And then we have a Sorceress at 2 minutes and 25 seconds. At least this is the timestamp. Keep in mind, some people started their video at like the end of the area where you would like load in. Sometimes people started before. So it's like, you know, there's a few variations in terms of stats. As far as the Wernado Druid build, that one is at 3 minutes and 31, and then we have the Hoda Barb coming in last place. But that's not the true actual tier list. You can't just go off of that, but I know some people want to do that. So if we're using that as our metric, because again, if we're looking like what class does the most numbers, right? Honestly, what it comes down to is the Rogue and the Sorcerer are like really, really high up there. Obviously, again, we're not counting this. If we count like this glitch where people are hitting for like 100 million plus, the Necromancer is actually just a little bit faster than the rest. And then with Druid, I would say it's within like margin, right? It's not that far off, but Barb is like way further behind if we were to look at like raw numbers. But when it comes down to gameplay, we also have to factor in how many builds are actually playable, because if you're not playing that one meta build, especially with Necromancer, has this problem where if you're not playing Bone Spear, your clear speed is significantly slower than any of the other classes in like the higher tier Nightmare Dungeons. But I want to use this kind of as a metric as well. So I'm going to use D4 builds here just so we can understand the metagame, because this is not the actual tier list. The actual tier list, you'll see in a second, is going to be very different from what this actually is. So if we're talking about like raw numbers in terms of damage with like a boss, right? That would be the tier list right there. But I also want to go over like how hard is it to gear and also the variety in terms of what we can play. And I know some people just want to know like, bro, just give me the tier list. It's not that simple in the game, because we have to look at clear speed as well. So in terms of actually getting gear, now it depends obviously on what you're playing. I'm just going to cover basically what's the meta here. And we're also kind of looking at the game where you're not doing the highest tier of dungeons. And what I mean by the highest tier of dungeons is most people will never reach level 100. Most people are not going to clear out a tier 100 sigil. That's very unrealistic. I'm going to use a baseline of basically world tier 4, which is what you're seeing mostly in the gameplay for background here. At about around 70 to 80 is usually where people will be like, okay, I'm waiting for the next season to start. That's where most people will actually hit. So in terms of like how easy is it to actually gear these characters and actually play and have a really good time, Rogue is 100% 100% in the S tier. It is so easy to literally get the dancing aspects and then just mow through content. Whereas other classes, for example, like the Barbarian and the Sorceress, you need insane cooldown to get it running. With Necromancer, you can get a huge amount of damage really earlier on. Druid has to get this unique, so Druid would honestly be in like the lower tier, because if you want to play the best Druid build, if you want to play the Stormwolf Druid, the Tornadoes, you need a unique, otherwise the build simply does not function, right? Whereas you can play Ice Shard Sorceress, you can play pretty much everything on the Barbarian in terms of a core skill. That's what it would look like in terms of how hard is it to actually gear these characters in order to actually do higher level pieces of content, where this might be a better tier list for most players in terms of being able to gear up and play and just get to World Tier 4 and have some fun with the game. Because again, if we're looking about the highest tier of content, which I want to cover in this video as well, and I'll also briefly kind of cover variety gameplay, because some builds like Necromancer, if you're not playing Bone Spears, you're gonna have relatively bad time. I know a lot of people want to play the Summoning Necro, and it does work. I see this time and time again where people are like, dude, Summoning Necro, it does not work. It's because you're not building it correct. But, you know, honestly, it's because Bone Spear is honestly super, super good. But this would be the tier list I would use if I was to go over a tier list in terms of like how easy is it to play, have fun, and actually gear up. So that would be that tier list. Okay, so I'm making like several tier lists in this video, but the reason why is because it's not realistic for most people to hit like level 100. If I was to make a tier list for like level 100, like we're talking about people that have like the most time to put into a character, this is basically what I would say most people want at the end of the day. Just want to know at the highest level, what's the best character? Honestly, my tier list hasn't changed from its initial like iteration, which means Barbarian is insane, the Druid is insane. Again, this is with the Werewolf, with the Tornadoes, and a Bone Spear Necromancer. This is honestly what I had for my S tier in the original video when I had at launch. Now, the thing with Wizard or Sorceress and the Demon Hunter, if you have good gear, they can actually be quite great. Now, the thing with the Sorceress is you have to play the Frost Nova, and you have to activate the bar to actually immobilize, freeze, stun. It counts as everything on these bosses in order to get your big damage. So with the Rogue, it depends on what build you're playing, but the reason why these characters are a little bit lower than the other characters is the Unstoppable on specifically the Druid and Barbarian are just significantly better. The thing with the Sorceress, it depends on which build you're also playing, but you need to be able to freeze things in order for you to realistically deal any damage, and it is kind of a obstacle that you need to get enough cooldown reduction for these characters to matter. I mean, it's the same thing with Barb. You need a lot of cooldown to keep up your abilities for your shouts to actually survive. But if we're talking about the highest tier, I would say the Bone Spear Necromancer is actually one of the safest. When you go to the highest tier in the game, we're talking tier 100, because Necromancer hits so far away and hits consistent for millions of damage, it probably kind of looks something like this if you want to do like tier 100s, but for the most part, I would say that it would look something like this. This would be the honest tier list that most people would probably understand in terms of min-maxing. Now, I also want to go over briefly variety, because, you know, people want to play usually more than one thing. So this is going to be the overall tier list. I would say this is what it would look like for min-maxers for most builds. Now, I will also mention that it depends on what you want to play. So I want to go ahead and let's give you guys some variety gameplay over here. So let's give you guys some Frozen Sorceress, because I actually really like this build. It's really fun. So starting off with Barb in terms of a tier list, in terms of like how many builds can actually play at the relatively like higher levels of the game. Again, talking about doing like level like 80-ish content. All right. So looking at this tier list in terms of variety, what can you actually play? So let's move all down to the placeholder section here. So in terms of what you can play with the Barbarian, pretty much everything in terms of a core skill is pretty viable, surprisingly. So with Barbarian, I would have to go with like an S tier, because most of the core skills, which is kind of what the game wants you to do in terms of your DPS, Barb has a lot of variety. Now, in terms of your build diversity with Barbarian, it is usually run triple shouts, run the ultimate skill, which is called Wrath of the Berserker. That's pretty much every single build with Barbarian, but in terms of the gameplay, all of the core skills are viable. So in terms of build diversity, while there is a lot, you always have to basically throw in the triple shouts, and you have to also throw in your Wrath of the Berserker. So it lacks in build diversity for that reason, but the core skills are all there. So you can put an A or S tier easily with Barbarian in terms of diversity, and this is very important when I always think about when people are asking, you know, what build should I play? You definitely want a build that can play multiple things if you are a gamer that needs to have variety to have fun, because at the end of the day, usually people are looking at tier lists not only for the best character, but also to have fun. That's a huge thing with any video game. You want to have fun, right? With Druid, I'd honestly say Pulverize or Stormwolf Druid is kind of the only two options that you have. There is technically the Earthen and the Trample Slide, and there's also the other build where you use like Slash Clash when you get like a plus 14 to like a skill that's a basic skill, which actually through time could actually become very good, but I'd put it in like the B tier. You have like a couple options. For Rogue, I would honestly put it in C tier. So as far as Rogue goes, in terms of like what's actually popular, it's basically, look at it, Twisting Blades, Flurry is terrible, to be honest. It's like 1/3 the damage. It's very low. If you guys want to watch me solo the world boss using Twisting Blades and watch me attempt to solo the world boss with Flurry. Couldn't do it with Flurry. Twisting Blades is just way better. There is Penetrating Shot. I think Penetrating Shot has some potential for pushing super high. Like basically you shoot the enemy and you run away, you shoot the enemy and you run away, and then you could eventually clear out like the tier 100s, right? But realistically, no one really wants to play like that. That's not a good way to play. That's to like do some sort of like high tier content. You do it once and that's kind of it, right? So as far as Rogue goes, I would say Twisting Blades and maybe you could argue Penetrating Shot or some sort of range build, but Flurry is just not simply there. I would say, especially in the earlier stages of the game, Twisting Blades is kind of like the only thing you really play. That's just my personal opinion, but you could definitely play range. I just think it's just by far inferior in terms of its playstyle. Next up, as far as the, let's do Sorceress next. So as far as Sorceress goes, there are a few different builds. I would say most people will probably not enjoy Arc Lash, and the reason why is you have to play in melee range. You're playing a Sorceress, usually you'd think that's a caster. And while Arc Lash does activate a bunch of different abilities, the problem with Arc Lash is it's melee and you don't have Unstoppable. So that for like the high and min-maxers is probably not going to be playable, but leveling through the campaign, Arc Lash is by far one of my favorites. I think it's the best leveling build in the entire game, hands down. But Firewall Sorceress, it's a really niche thing to play. Most people will probably end up playing a Ice variant, which is Ice Shards or Blizzard. That's realistically kind of where I'd put the Sorceress. You have a few different options, but most of them are kind of like weak compared to, again, what is offered with the class as of right now. Chain Lightning and Hydra were originally the best, and I loved them, but sadly they got nerfed to the ground in the server slam, so they're not viable right now. And with the most recent update, Frozen Orb did get a buff, so I'd say B tier is a very safe and reasonable spot. Now, in terms of Necromancer, because this is the next thing that we're going to talk about, and it's the final class in terms of the tier list for variety, because I feel like this does matter quite a bit. With Necromancer, I would say your only viable option is Bone Spear. As far as the minions go, you can see no one right here is even playing minions. It is hard. You need a very special, unique item, and when you go to like a unique item, sometimes some of these items, people are like, dude, I've hit level 80, 90, I cannot get that, Druid unique, and you kind of need that Druid unique to actually function if you want to play like the Werewolf Tornado build. I gotta put the Necromancer in here as well. Now, again, with the Barbarian, every core skill is viable on the game in terms of gameplay, but I could say easily maybe you can bring down Barbarian. So this would be kind of an area where I would say Barbarian does have all the core skills active, but thinking about it now, since you do have to play the triple shouts right now, it does make it a little bit less interesting, but every core skill is viable, right? And that could be a very important thing to look at. So this is going to be my tier list right here for if you want to have variety. So let's go and do a quick recap, because I know this is pretty much coming down to this. This is what I would consider to be the tier list as far as most players in terms of min-maxing. The characters are actually pretty solid, so don't worry too much about a tier list in terms of like what character you should play. Find the character that you actually enjoy and have the most fun with. I would say if you're thinking about playing character, literally play all the characters to level 30 and see what skills, specifically looking at the core skills for every single class, with the exception of the Sorceress. With the Sorceress, you can look at the mastery skills. You can run Blizzard, you can run Firewall, you can run Meteor. They have a little bit more play in terms of options with some of the skills that can be viable, and most of them will be viable as long as you are willing to put in the time. You can build almost anything in this game and make it pretty decent once you're a high enough level, because you have simply the damage numbers to kind of have fun with the game. But when you get to the highest tier of the game, the monsters just simply do a lot of damage. So, and on top of that, getting stunned, frozen is a very relevant thing. But that's going to wrap it up. That's going to be my updated tier list after all of the buffs, nerfs, and the changes that we recently got on the 27th. But there's so much to go over. Most of these, honestly, they're like 2% damage. It is a pretty big, massive thing for certain characters to get certain like numerical changes, but overall, it's going to be small in terms of the meta. They didn't nerf anything, but that's going to be wrapping it up for calling season 0 right now for the game. But obviously season 1 is just around the corner, and I'll update you guys with a season 1 tier list once we get the new info on what is going to be dropping, getting buffed and nerfed for season 1. But anyways, if you guys enjoyed it, subscribe to the channel if you'd like to see more of my content, and I'll see you guys in the next one. And let me know, guys, your tier list, because technically everyone's tier list is going to be a little bit different, but that's what I would consider the ultimate tier list. Peace out, and check the pinned comment for even more Diablo content.